the 6th of June, 1944, Vierville-sur-Mer. The surf is grey when machine guns from the 352nd Infantry Division cut the first waves flat on Omaha's shingle. Major General Leonard Guerreau's V Corps is pinned until destroyers, under Rear Admiral Alan Kirk, shear in so close their screws bite sand. USS McCook trains her guns nearly level and hurls steel straight into a concrete embrasure above the D1 draw. The hillside coughs dust and rebar. The long burst dies mid-scream, and a lane appears where none existed a minute before. On the strand, a flamethrower team from the 1st Infantry clears a trench mouth as Bangalore charges lift wire. Colonel George Taylor's voice carries as men stand and run because there is finally a place to run to. High on the ridge, another destroyer slides closer, and the ground begins to thud in a measured walk 200 yards at a time. West along the cliffs, Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder's Rangers climb wet rope at Pointe du Hoc, while USS Satterlee smashes the casemates. A grenade rolls a blast, thumps flat. A gun pit is found empty and useless. East, by the Orne Major John Howard's glider company holds the Benouville Bridge under Major General Richard Gale. The beach goes quiet like a door has shut. The 6th of June, 1944, from first light to late afternoon in Normandy. The problem is simple and merciless. Open at least 2 exits per beach, hold the bridges and causeways, and keep German reserves from touching the surf before dark. On the American front at Omaha and Utah, and on the British-Canadian front at Sword and Juneau, that chain depends on specific hands. At Omaha, Major General Leonard Guerreau drives the 1st Infantry Division under Major General Clarence Huebner, and the 29th Infantry Division under Major General Charles Gerhardt against the D1 and E1 draws. While rear, Admiral Alan Kirk's Western Naval Task Force rams destroyers into pistol-shot range to smash the embrasures the infantry cannot. At Utah, Lieutenant General J. Lawton Collins accepts a mislanding, pivots right, and treats the causeways as the objective rather than the sand. Behind the beaches, the road net matters more than any one trench. Paratroopers under Major General Matthew Ridgway and Major General Maxwell Taylor sit on culverts and crossroads the German timetable requires. Scattered at dawn, they congeal into knots that mine a lane cut a wire and turn movement into risk. Eastward along the Orne, Major General Richard Gale's 6th Airborne keeps the Benouville Bridge in Allied hands because Major John Howard's company landed beside it and never traded position for noise. That hinge keeps a path open for Major General Tom Rennie's 3rd British Division and denies an easy daylight thrust back to the coast. Across the line, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt commands OB West and Field Marshal Erwin Rommel owns the beach plan. But the 352nd Infantry Division under Generalleutnant Dietrich Krase cannot bring its full weight to a single exit, while the 716th Static Division holds the shoreline and the 21st Panzer Division under General Major Edgar Fürstinger feels for gaps near Caen and the Orne. When armour tests the flats, it meets rocket-armed fighter bombers from 2nd Tactical Air Force and IX Tactical Air Command and naval guns that still reach the near countryside. The stakes are counted by hours. If exits breathe until evening, the beachhead will not be erased in the next 24. If causeways are shut by noon, the surf becomes a trap. By early afternoon, a pattern shows to men who see only their field of fire. A shattered casemate becomes a lane, a held bridge becomes a fact, a causeway left open becomes a road for the evening tide. The promise to push the invader into the sea by nightfall requires erasure. The exits do not close, the bridges do not change hands, and the clock no longer belongs to the German plan. Morning to early afternoon on the 6th of June, 1944 in Normandy remains the entire window. Actions occur only at Omaha's D1 and E1, draws the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc and the Orne Canal Bridge at Benouville, with no line crossing beyond that day or those places. The objective is to show how fixed defences designed to freeze waterline infantry were broken by a repeatable chain that married close naval gunfire, disciplined engineer breaching, and short-range infantry, cleansing of trenches, and casemates. The emphasis is on mechanisms that can be scheduled and reproduced, not a single dramatic swing. American ground elements center on the 1st Infantry Division under Clarence Huebner and the 29th Infantry Division under Charles Gerhardt, inside V Corps under Leonard Guerreau, with regimental effort pressing both D1 and E1 to prevent the German 352nd from concentrating fire on one choke. Naval support belongs to Rear Admiral Alan Kirk's Western Naval Task Force, with destroyers including USS McCook DD 496 and USS Doyle DD 494, closing to nearshore ranges inappropriate for textbook gunnery, decisive for collapsing embrasures. At the cliffs, the 2nd and 5th Ranger battalions under James Rudder climb under covering fire from USS Satterlee DD 626, while the battleship Texas BB-35 contributes against coastal batteries and strongpoints that influence the Omaha sector. Eastward, the bridge at Benouville remains a silent hinge held by John Howard's company under Richard Gale's 6th Airborne, a fact that limits German freedom to counterattack toward the surf in daylight. German forces are the 352nd Infantry Division under Dietrich Kress on Omaha's heights, with machine guns, mortars, and pre-registered sectors tied to waterline obstacles and mined approaches. The 716th Static Division, along adjacent coastal frontage, and 21st Panzer Division under Edgar Fürchtinger, probing between Caen and the Orne. Command authority sits with Gerd von Rundstedt at OB West and Erwin Rommel at Army Group B. No invented units, call signs, or personalities are introduced. All names, ranks, and formations remain verifiable within the D-Day record. The first mechanism is the transformation of naval gunfire from area bombardment to near horizontal precision at ranges well inside comfort. A destroyer noses in until the prop wash tastes sand. Fire control talks in plain bearings. A single casemate aperture is treated as a target that must stop speaking within seconds, not minutes. The observable effect is interior collapse, concrete spalls, inward dust plumes, and the continuous machine gun tone that combs the shingle fractures into silence. This effect is the prerequisite, not the finish. The second mechanism is engineer breaching executed as a drill. While a base of fire element holds German heads down Bangalore, torpedoes are slid beneath wire anchored by stakes. Detonation lifts a mouth in the obstacle belt. The opening is exploited at once by 2 to 4 men, whose task is not to win a firefight, but to widen the mouth into a lane that squads behind can recognize without orders. Flamethrower bursts are applied as a short, controlled key at trench entries or casemate throats. Grenades are rolled or tossed to angles where concussion works and line of sight does not. Lane marking follows using whatever is available cloth chalk, a simple symbol, so that the next group can pass without redeciding the route under fire. The third mechanism is iteration at a neighbor draw so the defender cannot mass. The pattern repeats: another destroyer, run another wire lift, another trench cleared, a second lane breathing on a different tempo. When 2 perpendicularly inclined exits exist at once, the static geometry of interlocking fires begins to fail, because each weapon cannot rake both lanes without exposing itself to naval or infantry angles. It cannot survive. Micro-engagement 1 is a destroyer's initial close-range strike against a named strongpoint above D, one quickly followed by engineer opening and a small infantry element seeding the first lane with a mark that can be read by men several echelons back. Micro-engagement 2 is a second destroyer pass against a neighboring strongpoint covering E1, executed not as a daring one-off, but as a planned repetition that collapses a second aperture and presents the 352nd with a problem in simultaneous maintenance of fire they cannot solve. Both instances end with the same outcome: a shut casemate, a breathing lane, and infantry crossing ground they could not use 10 minutes earlier. Pointe du Hoc functions as parallel proof that cliffs and batteries are not constants. Rangers ascend on wet rope with hands learning stone in real time. Grenades convert interior space from weapon station to empty room. When guns are absent, mounts, sights, and traverse mechanisms are smashed, so the position cannot be restored in a useful time frame. The meaning is not tallying a trophy. It is subtracting a threat from the beach calculus and demonstrating that vertical ground is a stair when ropes and discipline exist. The German plan does not fail for lack of courage or craft. It fails when the information and movement assumptions behind a static diagram are invalidated. Pre-registered mortar lines are correct until dust and concussion shift aim points, and observers cannot signal corrections through cut wires or lethal intervals for runners. Machine gun teams can be superb until an embrasure is treated as a throat for a naval shell at pistol range. Reserve orders can be timely in theory until the roads and culverts they must traverse are held by airborne knots that mine shoot and delay at every hedge. The most elegant lattice of interlocking fires presumes the attacker will be present only at the waterline and on a predictable rhythm. Simultaneous lanes and near-shore guns erase that rhythm. Sensory anchors for later writing remain concrete and spare grey. Sea-chopped, surf-compressed thunder of near-flat naval guns, the metallic cough of concrete failing inward, the soft, table-flat thud of bangalores under wet sand. Brief dragon-breath rush at a trench mouth, a grenade's dull report behind a corner radio, fragments strangled by static and dust. The feel underfoot shifts from suction at the waterline to powder on a slope knocked loose by concussions. The air tastes of lime and burnt oil rather than salt alone. Nothing lyrical is required. Simple physical truth keeps the scene credible. The measure of success is not a flag in a frame, but a timetable. First lane breathing within the morning cycle, second lane opening before noon, causeways behind Utah, unsealed by midday, because road knots deny German convergence the Orne. Bridge remaining allied so that any armoured daylight thrust north risks aircraft and naval guns. The text must make clear that once two exits breathe erasure by nightfall becomes unattainable with forces and command latency available to the defender. All conclusions stay inside the day. No claim that the war has been decided. Only the claim that the mechanism to erase the landing on June 6 has broken. Every step, name and place can be checked against the record. The voice avoids slogan, avoids heroized duel, and treats the American side as procedure carried through under pressure, while the German side is a script whose cues no longer arrive on time. The closing idea is simple enough to be remembered without adornment. The pattern itself is the result. When an embrasure can be silenced on schedule, and a lane can be opened where and when needed, beaches stop being endpoints and become corridors, and a corridor that survives to evening cannot be swept back into the sea that day. Morning to late afternoon on the 6th of June 1944 remains the only window. The action stays on Omaha's D1, and E1 draws the adjoining bluffs. The immediate hinterland hedgerows within a short climb of the beach, the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc only as a cutaway reference when needed for rhythm, and the Orne Canal Bridge at Benouville solely as a quiet counterpoint to show how a held hinge feels from a soldier's eye. The intent is to move from mechanisms to people. A German crew inside a waterline strongpoint, looking downslope as their script phrase. An American assault team stepping off the shingle through a freshly blown gap, a small airborne knot, at a Bettig culvert behind Utah, translating scattering into control. The writing keeps names and units verifiable, uses only what June 6 actually offers, and resists any dual framing. The tone is immediate, concrete, and spare. The camera never floats into omniscience without tying back to a person who would plausibly sense what we describe. The first strand follows a German machine gun team in a wider stand's nest above one of the draws that feed the beach. The crew has drilled for years on interlocking arcs and pre-registered mortar strips, but the day presents dust, concussion, and near-flat naval guns that arrive in footsteps. One gunner fights his weapon and his fear of being seen through the very opening that gives him power. His loader counts belt links and tries to hear a section leader over a field telephone that now transmits only hiss between shocks. The observation slit is not a window into a panorama. It is a narrow rectangle where surf, smoke, and fragments slice the world into a strobing loop. The moment of change is not the first shell impact, but the instant the team recognizes that their corrections no longer matter because the embrasure itself is the target. Their internal monologue is technical, not lyrical. The weapon's rhythm, the burn of a hot barrel sleeve, the grit in the teeth, the odd calm of drilled motions continuing, while the structure itself begins to cough, concrete dust inward. The camera stays tight, holds the sound of a burst breaking off midstream, then sits with the knowledge that the next order cannot arrive in time because the line is literally falling in. The second strand lives at the lip of the surf, where a small element from the 16th Infantry Regiment has just watched a destroyer flatten a voice on the hill. The men move because the plan demands momentum before the defender can breathe. An engineer pairs shoulders, bangalore sections like awkward fence rails. A rifleman covers another, packs a spare fuse, and the non-commissioned officer counts down loud enough to be heard but not screamed. The set pieces are short and factual. A crawl, a slide, a push, a flat detonation that lifts wire and posts, a flamethrower hum at a trench mouth held for less than a second to avoid wasting fuel, 2 grenades rolled rather than thrown to avoid silhouetting a head over the lip, a hand signal that means follow this exact line. The audience should feel decisions in the body, the weight of wet webbing, the texture of the shingle shifting under knees, the snap of a safety, the taste of lime and burnt oil when a casemate spalls. The camera earns a brief look back downslope, only after the lane is marked with something that hundreds can read without another shouted word. The men are not speechmakers. Their vocabulary is verbs. A third strand brings a 101st Airborne Pathfinder or small stick into focus at a culvert and road junction behind Utah. The world here is not a beach. It is hedgerow country that smells of wet earth. Scattered drops at first light have become a thin net drawn across the roads that German reserves need. The small team wires the culvert, places a sign at an angle. Only friendlies will recognize, sets a field of fire that trades glory for geometry, and rehearses a short list of questions for any vehicle that arrives too fast. The writing notes the flipping of a mine's safety, the grease on a Garand's bolt, the way a wristwatch face catches a strip of sun in a ditch, the patience of men who will not be filmed unless something chooses to come to them. It is less about combat and more about denying the enemy a clock. The sequence ends with a delay achieved minutes, not hours, and the knowledge that minutes are currency today. A quiet intercut at Benouville shows Major John Howard's company holding the canal bridge without spectacle. The sound here is boots on steel, a low voice giving sectors a Bren's slow thud, used more as punctuation than as speech, a runner who actually returns. The point is to let viewers feel what a hinge feels like when it is working orderly, almost boring and decisive, because boredom means the route remains open for armor that needs it. The bridge is not a stage. It is a piece of steel that stays where it must stay while other men bleed for lanes elsewhere. The narrative returns to the bluff at Omaha, where a squad reaches the rim and discovers that climbing is only the beginning. The ground is powdery where concussions have shaken soil loose. The first step over the lip risks a grazing burst from a secondary position not mentioned in any frank talk on the beach. The team leader assigns a left-right check that takes 6 seconds, and a lifetime places a light machine gun at a shallow angle to sweep a probable trench line, and motions a pair toward a communication trench that snakes into a fold of ground. A mortar thumps from behind them and strikes a meter short because the crew firing it is shooting by memory through dust. A radio call gets 3 words across enough to mean keep pushing. The moment to hold on a face is the instant a young soldier realizes the fear he carried on the sand has been replaced by something colder, a list of tasks he knows how to do. The German perspective re-enters the frame at a position neighboring the now silent casemate. A section leader calculates whether to move a team across a cut to support the next embrasure, but every interval between cover points has become a hallway, filled at random times by naval shells and fighter bombers that arrive as soon as dust clears. He looks for runners and finds only men flattening into earth because standing upright has become an invitation. He does not lack courage. He lacks a method to convert courage into effect while communication is broken. He knows reserves exist, but also knows that roads below and to the flank are no longer safe. He has heard rumors of paratroopers sitting on culverts, and the rumor feels true because messengers do not return on time. The decision he makes is to hold, and holding is the wrong answer today, because it allows 2 exits to breathe at once. The human layer should never become sermon. People in this sequence do small things well under bad conditions. The writing avoids long speeches and uses only names and details that belong on that day. There is breathing room in the soundtrack, waves chopping a destroyer gun, speaking flat, the cough of concrete failing inward, the dull hop of grenades, the light hiss of a flamethrower's first breath, a clipped order, a radio squawk strangled by static. Silence is allowed after a shock. The rhythm is heart rate, not orchestra. Everything stays inside June 6. No foresight, no prophecy, no claim that a war turns in a minute. The only claim is that men on both sides feel a script changing and must decide inside that hour how to act. The German crew feels their aperture become a target and learns that interlocking arcs do not interlock when two lanes exist and naval guns sit within 1,000 yards. The American team feels the ground give them a corridor and decides to keep that corridor breathing for the next file of men. The airborne knot learns that delay is victory at a scale they cannot see and acts like timekeepers armed with rifles. The last notes are physical, a chalk X on a post at the lane's edge that later files will trust with their lives, a coil of cut wire still warm to the touch, a helmet with new pockmarks that were not there an hour ago, a field telephone handset hanging half out of a recess, still connected to a line that hums with nothing, a watch face showing a time not special in any history book, but remembered forever by the man whose pulse matched it while he crossed a patch of ground that used to be impossible. The 6th of June. 1944 remains the only time in view, and the thread to follow is how choices, authorities, and logistics turned hard problems into scheduled tasks. The first choice belongs at sea. Rear Admiral Alan Kirk's destroyers were not built to be cliff guns, but the decision to drive them inside comfortable depth made concrete behave like timber. That risk is not glamour. It is a calculation anchored by charts, tide tables, and a clear view of the alternative, which was bleeding on the shingle, while casemates stayed fluent. Fire control parties talked in bearings and yards rather than big ideas, and captains accepted a sand-biting margin, so gunners could treat each embrasure as a target to be shut in seconds. The effect was to create windows that infantry and engineers could exploit on a timetable. Without that authority exercised at the right hour, everything else remains theory. On the beach, the controlling idea is that movement must outrun German recovery. Major General Leonard Giraud kept pressure along both the D1 and E1 draws, so the 352nd Infantry Division could not stack its answer at a single mouth. That is a staff decision as much as a field one. Keep fires, requests, and engineer assets oriented on two lanes, even if one looks briefly more promising, because dual exits force the defender to lose the geometry he trained for. The 1st Infantry Division under Clarence Hubner and the 29th under Charles Gerhardt did not ask the ground to be fair. They asked it to be predictable enough to execute a drill. Base of fire, Bangalore, flame grenade, mark pull-through. The procedure lives because higher headquarters refuses to collapse everything onto the nearest noise. The adjacent American beach shows a different but related call. At Utah, the first waves landed off the intended sector, and Lieutenant General J. Lawton Collins accepted that the tide had redrawn the plan. Pivot right own the causeways, let the drop zones and paratroop knots define the useful road net instead of trying to repaint the sea. That decision saves time, and time is the currency the German counterscript needs more than ammunition. A mislanding becomes an accelerant when command stops worshipping maps. The 82nd under Matthew Ridgway and the 101st under Maxwell Taylor deliver exactly the kind of friction that multiplies a good call: crossroads, occupied culverts, wired questions, asked by small groups that make bigger groups. Late. Air-ground integration during daylight is not a slogan either. It is a series of permissions and radios that let fighter bombers and naval guns strike armor and columns as soon as they show. The 2nd Tactical Air Force on the British side and IX Tactical Air Command on the American side could not erase a division, but they could erase minutes every time a German unit tried to move in the open. Those minutes do not show on maps. They show as counterattacks that arrive piecemeal and out of breath. A Panzer battalion that rolls at noon under clear weather inherits rocket trails and splash markers. Even if losses are light, speed is gone, and speed is the only ally of a static plan trying to become mobile for a few decisive hours. German command relationships matter because the window is short. Gerd von Rundstedt owns the west, and Erwin Rommel owns the beaches, but authority over armoured reserves is not a lever in a single hand. Requests, confirmations, and a doctrine that assumed enemy air would not own the daytime sky all conspire to turn a fast answer into a slow one. Communications that should have been corridors become mazes because wires are cut by bombardment and runners cannot confidently cross intervals that naval shells walk at tight steps. The result is not cowardice, it is latency, and latency is defeat when the opponent is building exits that will be unerasable by evening. The 21st Panzer Division under Edgar Feuchtinger illustrates the bind. Probing between Caen and the Orne, its elements could threaten a hinge if they mass and move with tempo. But the bridge at Benouville sits under British hands. The air above the flats carries watchful eyes, and every kilometre toward the coast is a bet against rocket-firing aircraft and naval guns that can still reach the near countryside. Subordinate groups like the formation under Hans von Luck are competent and aggressive, yet competence cannot conjure a corridor through daylight interdiction and fractured orders. The shape of the day forces a split personality, one part testing, one part waiting, both parts watched. No amount of steel inside a turret solves the clock. At Omaha, the decisive leadership quality is permission to continue procedure despite shock. That means authorizing destroyers to re-attack new apertures rather than orbit after a dramatic first success. It means accepting casualties at the mouth of a newly opened lane and still sending the second and third squads through, because the only thing worse than a costly opening is leaving it to be re-sighted by the defender. It means trusting engineer officers when they say a blast must go here, not there, even if there is closer to the last burst. It means telling battalion commanders to hold two objectives in their heads at once and refusing to let the day be decided by a single stair cut through the bluffs. Logistics presents itself in humble shapes. Bangalore sections exist in sufficient number because someone shipped them in bulk and parcelled them properly. Flamethrower fuel arrives at the right beach because labelling and preload discipline were treated as combat multipliers months earlier. Demolition caps and priming cord are in the right satchels because a supply sergeant at a port far away respected lists. Radios work often enough because spares are on hand, and batteries are not a rumour. None of these items win a frame. All of them prevent failure in the frames that matter. The same quiet arithmetic holds for naval ammunition. Destroyers can afford a second and third corrective run because magazines are stocked for work, not for parades, and because replenishment plans accept that gunnery near sand is not extravagance, but the point. Doctrine bends without breaking. American infantry doctrine assumed combined arms and maneuver. The beach strips deny both until the cliff line is breached. The adaptation is to compress combined arms into 50-metre packages. Naval gun becomes direct fire. Artillery engineer becomes armoured fist rifle. Squad becomes the shock element that would otherwise ride behind a tank. None of this is beautiful. All of this is legal within the logic of survival. On the German side, a doctrine of carefully layered fires meets an attacker who insists on generating two asynchronous problems instead of one. The result is that perfectly competent crews spend their last effective minutes trying to decide which rhythm to answer, while the other rhythm opens the door. Decisions that look small in language are large in effect. Keep destroyers inside shoal soundings as long as spotting remains useful. Prioritize shutting talking apertures over pulverizing pretty concrete. Resist the urge to over-concentrate on the first promising exit. Keep the second in motion so the enemy cannot stack. Treat every minute behind Utah's causeways as a compound interest account funded by airborne delay. Leave the Benouville hinge quiet and alive, rather than loud and heroic. None of these choices concern posters. All of them concern hours, and hours are what the eraser doctrine needs. The limit of the day is the proper limit of the text. No victory lap, no prophecy. By late afternoon, the texture of command has changed. Orders grow shorter because units now understand the pattern. Reports grow clearer because the most dangerous noises on the net have been silenced at their source rather than merely talked around. Movements become less about pleading with ground and more about using corridors that exist on a schedule. The German counterscript has not vanished. It has missed its performance time. The usable summary is not a slogan. Naval guns at ranges better measured by street names collapse the parts of bunkers that matter. Engineer drills convert obstacles into consumables. Staff discipline sustains pressure along two exits until the defender's geometry fails. Air and sea deny the roads daylight needs. Reserve authority arrives too slowly to reclaim the surf. Procedure replaced panic, and that is how a beach becomes a port. Morning on June 6 begins with certainty atop the Norman bluffs. The certainty has a shape concrete, embrasures cut to rake the shingle machine guns with fields that interlock mortars, with lines measured into the surf wire and mines, set to make the first 10 meters fatal, and the next 30 meaningless. The certainty also has a sentence whispered along the line for months: push them back into the sea by nightfall. It is not bravado to the men on the heights. It is arithmetic. Hold the exits through noon counterattack, while the tide and confusion favor the defender. Erase the landing before heavy units can land. The first American waves that crumple on the stones look like confirmation of the old math. Then the old math starts taking on water from a direction it was not built to consider. A destroyer turns from a grey shape on the horizon into a blunt instrument within 1,000 yards, bow-tossing spray screws flirting with sand. The gun captain speaks in bearings, not slogans, and the first shell hits with a sound that is not a theatrical boom, but the inside-out cough of concrete failing in its throat. A long stream of 7.92 millimeters that combed the waterline breaks off mid-burst. A second shot hammers the same mouth, because shutting a voice requires repetition, not faith. Dust blows inward. The embrasure's slit glows with powder and grit. The field telephone that carried orders a minute ago now carries nothing. The certainty atop the bluff acquires a seam. It is not dramatic to the men inside. It is merely the feeling of a plan discovering a variable it did not account for. On the stones below, movement that had looked like a suicide note turns into a drill. Bangalore sections slide under wire. A flat detonation makes a mouth where there was none. A flamethrower puts a brief tongue of heat into a trench lip. 2 grenades hop once and finish the argument out of sight. A hand signal replaces 3 sentences. A cloth strip, or chalk line, tells the next file exactly where not to die. A squad stands where no one could stand 5 minutes earlier. The old sentence on the bluff depends on preventing that tiny conversion opening into lane at every exit. It cannot prevent 2 of them at once. A second destroyer run against the next strongpoint does not feel like boldness to its crew. It feels like a second item on a list. The guns speak flat. The slope replies with the same inward collapse. A second lane begins to breathe with a different tempo. Geometry that once made sense from a training sketch refuses to work when 2 perpendicular problems exist simultaneously. A machine gun team can rake a beach. It cannot rake 2 moving corridors and remain unobserved by ships that treat its aperture as a target rather than a feature. The defender's excellence runs into the limits of being in one place at one time, with a diagram that assumed the enemy would be in one place at one time too. Along the cliffs westward, where the map labels promise permanence, ropes turn vertical ground into a staircase. Rangers climb with the stubborn rhythm of wet palms and braced boots, while Satterlee keeps stone mouths busy. A grenade turns a room from weapon station to husk. Mounts and sights are smashed, traverse gears broken, and the absence of guns in the right places becomes a fact that needs no commentary. The landing's arithmetic changes by subtraction. The battery that was supposed to speak into the surf cannot, and the bluff line's promise loses another column from its ledger. The cliff was never the point, the clock was. The cliff has been made irrelevant to the clock. Behind Utah, the day acquires a quiet keeper. Scattered paratroopers under Matthew Ridgway and Maxwell Taylor settle into culverts and crossroads and turn the map from a set of lines into a net. A culvert is wired, a hedge is sighted, a wristwatch is checked, and a small team becomes a toll booth that charges minutes. German reserves do not need to be destroyed to be defeated. They need to be late. When minutes are the currency, an absence of spectacle can bankrupt a plan. The old sentence on the bluff relies on a counterattack assembled and present before dark. The counterattack begins to fracture into packets because roads that look open on maps are under observation by men who have no interest in glory, only schedules. East along the Orne, a steel truss remains where it was put, watched by Major John Howard's company under Richard Gale. The bridge does not need story. It needs to remain boring and passable. Its quiet fact denies a thrust that might have reached the surf in time to make the beach think again. When a hinge holds doors move for one side and not the other. The men on the bridge hear boots low, voices a Bren's punctuation, and the ordinary relief of a runner who returns. Their steadiness is not a different narrative thread. It is a support beam running under the entire day. Midday brings the first German probes between Caen and the Orne. Elements of 21st Panzer under Edgar Feuchtinger test the flats. The sky is not neutral. Fighter bombers from 2nd Tactical Air Force and IX Tactical Air Command look for movement and naval guns that once seemed a beach tool reach inland. Even when losses are not catastrophic, speed comes apart under rocket trails and splash markers, and the simple knowledge that the next kilometre is visible to a set of eyes equipped to add hazard to motion. The counterattack still exists on paper. It struggles to exist on time. The difference between the two is the day's entire argument. On the bluffs above Omaha, a machine gun team in a neighbouring casemate feels their position turn from instrument to subject. They know the drill for interlocking arcs and pre-registered mortar lines, but observation slits now frame dust and smoke that change faster than corrections can be relayed. Field telephones carry hiss because wires lie where naval guns walk. Runners flatten into earth and wait for intervals that do not exist. A section leader calculates whether to feed men across a cut to support the next mouth along the ridge. Every interval between cover points is a hallway that randomly fills with steel. He does not fail in courage. He fails to find a way to translate courage into effect while communications and movement assumptions are wrong. The old sentence above the waterline begins to feel like an order that cannot be fulfilled through any known path. Below the bluffs, the infantry that reach the rim discovers that the fight is not over and also not mysterious. Powdered soil from concussions makes poor footing. A grazing burst from a secondary position snaps across the lip and dies into dust. A team leader assigns a left-right check, places a light machine gun at a shallow angle, and sends a pair down a communication trench with a hand squeeze and a time. A mortar falls short because the crew firing it works through memory and smoke. A radio coughs 3 words, and a number enough to mean continue. The sensation in the men's bodies is not triumph. It is the relief of a list that still works. The collapse of the day's myth does not arrive as a single statement. It emerges as a pattern visible to people who do not know the whole coast. A corporal who carries Bangalore sections feels it when the second lane takes men he will never meet. A German loader feels it when his gun's voice falls silent, not because of ammunition or aim, but because the room's geometry is now a liability. A pilot with a Typhoon feels it when a column that looked coherent at a distance breaks into nervous fragments as soon as it enters the open. A sailor hears it in the decision to make a third run inside shoal soundings, because the interval between shots is the difference between a lane and a killing ground. The sentence rewords itself without anyone speaking. You do not push someone into the sea who already occupies the slope behind you. Afternoon on Omaha feels different underfoot. The shingle does not grab boots because men no longer need to live at the waterline. The bluff's path exists in enough places that a single lucky ricochet cannot erase the day's progress. Naval guns shift from emergency to routine call, bearing shut the aperture lift to the next. Engineer drills proceed with less drama and more speed. Radios carry fewer pleas and more confirmations. The map's lines begin to thicken as exits breathe continuously rather than in gasps. The counterattack still has pages to turn, but the book's binding has loosened. On the German side, the traveller's story grows longer between decision and effect. OB West under Gerd von Rundstedt and Army Group B under Erwin Rommel hold the levers in theory. In practice, reserve authority, conflicting interpretations, cut lines and open sky interdiction slow every motion that must be fast. A battalion that could have arrived with cohesion appears in parts. A company that might have hit a single lane meets 2 each with its own pulse. A platoon that could have crossed a field with confidence now imagines rockets in every shadow of a cloud and waits for an escort that cannot be promised. The men are the same. The clock is not. By late afternoon, concrete facts replace promised ones. A casemate that dominated the morning is a dark box with a collapsed throat and a field telephone hanging useless. A lane marked by a crude sign has passed hundreds of boots. A rope at the cliff's edge has grooves from many palms. A truss bridge eastward still holds with paint scratches where men have brushed past in the course of doing ordinary tasks with extraordinary significance. The tide turns, and the sea resumes its old voice. But no one on the bluff believes any more that the water can solve the problem beneath them. Nothing in the day grants prophecy. The war does not finish in an hour. The collapse involved here concerns a promise to delete what the morning landed. The promise required that exits be shut, bridges retaken, roads cleared for a massed push to the surf. The day answers with 2 exits on Omaha breathing at different tempos, with causeways behind Utah functioning because mislanding became advantage, and airborne knots held the road net, not with banners but with wire and patience with a hinge, at Benouville, that refused to swing back with armor probes that discovered daylight, was not their friend with destroyers, that understood concrete as a conversation and spoke at the right distance. What remains to the defenders as evening arrives is not the chance to erase, but the duty to fight a new battle beginning farther inland than the script allowed. A German gun captain who survives the day will afterward describe naval shells at close range in terms that sound like someone knocking at a door from the wrong side. An American engineer who crawled to the wire will remember the way lime dust turns spit chalky. A British private at the Canal Bridge will remember the sound of boots on steel louder than any shot because it meant weight crossing in the right direction. None of them know the entire line. All of them can tell you when the sentence above the surf lost its grammar. There is a moment in the late light when the beach goes quiet in the way that follows a job rather than a miracle. Men do not cheer. They drink, they run, they carry. They look for someone they cannot find. They look back down a slope that in the morning contained only death, and in the afternoon contains a route. The old plan on the bluff has not been dishonored. It has been made irrelevant by steps repeated until they made their own logic. A wall can stand in concrete and fail in time. The men who thought they might push an ocean with guns discover that their task has changed to holding fields and hedges against an army that did not drown. As darkness approaches, every sense confirms the same quiet verdict. The sea smells the same. The wind tastes of salt and cordite. The concrete still sits in the earth. The sentence about nightfall no longer applies to the present tense. The eraser failed. The day remains. By evening on June 6, 2 exits at Omaha breathe without interruption. Utah's causeways function, and the Benouville Bridge remains allied. The eraser promise dies with the light. What survives is a foothold that cannot be pushed back by any force Germany can assemble overnight under hostile sky and guns at sea. In the next days, engineers widen lanes, seed blockships for Mulberry, and drive roads off the bluffs. Paratroopers at the hedges become links between beaches. Carentan draws attention as the seam to be closed. Caen hardens into a separate fight. German counterattacks arrive in parts, slowed by cut wires, mined culverts, and aircraft clocks. Armour learns that midday movement is an invitation. Doctrine shifts quietly. Destroyers are written into breaching drills. Engineer schedules become artillery equivalents. Lane marking becomes command language, and air-sea coordination is treated as a timing weapon. The legacy on both sides is practical. Static geometry without rapid reserve authority fails when 2 exits run on different tempos. Procedure beats bravado when minutes decide outcomes. The next story begins inland hedgerows, towns, and the question of whether reliability and scheduled logistics can keep outrunning guns designed for duels.